let's move on to our next talk. And the title of our next talk is Engaging the Crowd, Social Movement Building via Online Bystander Mobilization. And we have Divya Siddarth from Microsoft Research for presenting the talk. Divya.
Hi, yes, sorry. Give me 1 second. I'm having a background issue. Okay. Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much, Anmol, for your talk. And I will be speaking, as mentioned, on bystander mobilization. Can someone confirm for me that the presentation is working?
We can see your screen. Do you want to? Yeah.
Okay, great. So, right, so what I'm going to be discussing is bystander mobilization online for social movement organizations. So first, a little bit of background on social media and social movements. There was, as we all know, and there's been a lot of work in this community, sort of a lot of initial hope around social media, revolutionizing organizing and activism, changing democratic participation and things like that. Over time, this hope has been tempered with a lot of different kinds of discourse on social media and how it relates to politics and activism. As we just saw with Anmol, these questions of extreme speech, of disinformation, of various kinds of participation that's both afforded for and not. So there's now a much more complicated discourse around social media and politics and social movements generally. And in this paper, we're going to specifically be approaching this idea of online social movement building through looking at bystanders, which we'll get to, and also focusing on social movement organizations. So while social movements are sort of collective challenges by people with common purposes, there are lots of general definitions around that space. Social movement organizations are the kinds of organizations that often drive these movements, and they serve to create methods of structured collaboration, outline the mechanics of struggle, frame movement goals, and it's this framing process that we're going to focus on here. And so our paper comes at it through this idea of bystander frame alignment. So we'll take this piece by piece, first looking at bystanders. So what do we mean by bystanders? Bystanders are basically the not too directly involved, but nevertheless sort of attentive audience or existing relevant audience that movements have to resonate with often in order to, get cultural power, delegitimize their opponents, and successfully create change. So bystanders are a huge piece of successful movement change. And the second piece is frame alignment. And so the concept of frames are these action-oriented sets of beliefs that serve to, put forth movement ideologies and foster participation. And frame alignment is this idea that SMOs or social movement organizations will deploy different types of frames for different audiences. So they want to align these frames with a particular audience's sort of pre-existing context, motivations, cultures, all of those things. So this concept of aligning those frames is referred to as frame alignment. So when we look at bystander frame alignment, it's trying to get at this question of how do you take a bystander to your movement and make them an adherent or a supporter of this movement? And this is one of the major drivers of social movement success. As mentioned, context in these kinds of questions is really important, and our study was conducted entirely in India. And so in a lot of different pieces of that context, one of the things we focused on was the class context of social media in India. And so even though, as Anmol said, the types of people and the audience generally of social media in India is growing, in many cases, the producers of the producer of information and the people who actively drive the discourse, actively engage with and set trends for content, generally continue to be from the middle and upper middle classes, generally are from urban contexts. And so there's a pretty specific demographic of those who are driving the discourse on social media. And this is important because in India, we are seeing that social media is increasingly becoming a space in which political agendas are not only disseminated to people, but are also crafted and updated, and people get feedback on them. And so it's become a primary outlet of public outreach and discussion, and also has important second order effects in terms of setting the media discourse, so traditional media discourse. So not only has social media become more central, it is still quite class segregated, and we also want to note fairly gender segregated as well. And so this is some of the context we're coming at this idea of bystander frame alignment with. So let's get to what we actually did. So we did a qualitative research study, interviews, observation, and worked with leaders, activists, and campaigners from 9 different social movement organizations. They varied in terms of the causes they were fighting for: gender rights, farmers and worker rights, anti-caste activism, anti-corruption, environmental justice, several different causes. And they also varied in sort of the type of social movement organization they were, with some focusing quite specifically on political demands, whereas others focusing more generally on cultural change. So these were the organizations that we worked with, and let's get to a little bit of what we saw. And so there are 4 kinds of frame alignment that the literature tells us are common and are needed in terms of social movements aligning with different audiences. And we actually did see most of these in the course of our interviews, so we'll get to that. So the first is frame bridging, which is this idea of you can link an unconnected audience frame by emphasizing already existing similarities between that frame and your movement organization. And the second is frame amplification, which is around highlighting and reinforcing, amplifying a specific value or belief or specific part of the movement in order to reach an audience that's already amenable to that frame, but may not be that amenable to the rest of the movement. So let's see an example. So this is a quote from one of our interviews. I'm interviewing a campaigner for this farmers organization in India, and this is what they say. So they say, "We are a left organization," so then they're Maoists, they're Naxalites, this is a violent leftist group in India, that starts. So to counter that, first we have personal stories. This is graphic, their legs are swollen, they're bleeding, they're falling walking. This is during a farmer's march, a long farmer's march to the capital for rights. And the second piece is they're in pain, so no one can counter that, right? These are tribals, poor farmers that are walking because they have to. Jai Kisan and that as well. We are India, we support our soldiers and our farmers. That will work on social media. And so we see a couple different types of frame alignment here, actually. The main one is this idea of frame amplification, which is that these are frames that are already part of the movement in a sense. I mean, we see that they are in pain, they're suffering. This is something that's part of the movement, but is also targeted to a bystander audience, and in some sense a middle-class bystander audience, who they've not shown a lot of regard in terms of the actual political rights they're campaigning for. They're asking for grain subsidies of specific kinds, they're asking for specific financial relief, but rather than focusing on the demands of the movement, it's this idea of, oh, these poor people are in pain, right? So you have to amplify, and they said this later in the interview, amplify the kinds of frames that are shocking to people, that get to them, even though the demands of the movement and the actual situation of these farmers in terms of a more specific outlook is not as aligned. And the second piece, which is kind of a question of frame bridging, is this idea of, we support our soldiers and our farmers, we are India. And so even though this is not, in a lot of senses, a very nationalist type of march, and actually the demands of the farmers in this march are a strong restructuring of the state, and the activists certainly don't identify as nationalists, they have to bridge their frame with this growing nationalism in the middle class community in India in terms of saying, bringing out this "we are India," the Jai Kisan, it's a sort of phrase, Jai Kisan, Jai Jawan, which means we support our soldiers and our farmers. And so it's bridging the frame of these farmers need specific assistance in these ways with this nationalism that genuinely isn't part of the movement, and creating that bridge to have success on social media. So those are some of those examples. The third piece is frame extension, which is, you extend your frame, you broaden your existing frame to include a target audience perceived interests. One of the main ways actually we saw this in terms of just observing social movement organizations is at rallies or events or meetings, there's a strong push towards including, a concert or a dance program of some kind. So just in small ways, extending your frame to include your target audience interests, to make it not just about the political piece, but about different parts of the movement or different things you want to emphasize. So these 3 types of frame alignment, and I did say there were 4, right? So these 3, you can see that they work by emphasizing or bridging or amplifying or extending into some already existing connection with your target audience. You kind of have to have an existing connection for these things to work. You can bridge to get there, you can extend to get there, you can amplify to get there, but something has to be there already. The 4th kind of frame transformation is used when there's very little existing alignment between your target audience, your bystander audience, and your social movement organization. So you really deeply need to go in and reframe, to educate, construct new meanings, to make this frame transformation happen to get to this audience. And this was the most difficult thing to do. I mean, it's generally very difficult, of course, but on social media, we found no examples across the board of any organization able to do this transformation work on social media. And the closest we got actually was this fully digital, sort of very urban feminist organization that we worked with. And they said, you know, we were talking about how do you get people who are anti-feminism, who would not identify as feminists, outside of this urban, more upper caste female community that they can see as their audience because they're a digital platform, so they know who their audience is. And they say, I think the most effective way for that to happen is for people to start talking to their friends and families. So we put out a lot of content about how to be an ally, easy things to say in private spaces. When you have these basic facts that you think I'm definitely on board with that, I'm going to share that so my conservative uncle can read and have a moment. We pick stories that are most feminism 101-y for WhatsApp for those kinds of shares. And we try to teach our audience how to have those conversations outside of our platform. So this fully digital platform is recognizing that they need to do that transformation work, but the most they can do is put out educational content for the people that, you know, adhere to their movement, as well as basically teaching them how do you do the frame transformation offline. And that seems to be the most specific way in which social media can lead to frame transformation, is at most as an educational vehicle to get someone else to do that transformation or to lead to transformation offline. So this brings us sort of to the main theme of our findings, which is this tension between short-term movement sustainability, which in a lot of ways social media, and we didn't go through all these examples, but it is effective for. I mean, movements consistently are able to raise funds for specific things, or they're able to get a certain number of signatures on petitions, or once in a while a video will go viral. So there are ways in which short-term movement sustainability can happen on social media, is happening on social media. But these long-term pieces of movements, the real transformation of frames, the sustainability of movements over the long term, this has been a huge struggle for activists of social movement organizations to do on social media. And, you know, particularly in India, coming back to that class context, the bystander context, given some of these class contexts and political values encoded in the bystander audience, it has been especially difficult to accomplish this long-term change in social media. I mean, of course, there are exceptions, and I think that is why bringing out that organization that is able to use social media as an education platform for second order frame transformation is important, because that seems to be the only way that these platforms can use in terms of these long-term movement change-making needs. And I will say there are also some nuances to this that we didn't quite have time to get into, but some of the more digital, more cultural organizations that had a more urban focus did do better at even the original, you know, bridging, alignment, amplification on social media, whereas the more rural organizations, the more deeply political organizations suffered the most. And I think this comes back to that idea of you can only do most of these tactics of frame alignment if you have some existing connection with your audience. And the farther out from the typical social media audience, the typical discourse setting audience a movement gets, the harder it is for them to do this kind of long-term change making on social media. And so we did see that even though movement activists went to great lengths to fit their, you know, narratives, goals, and asks with these bystander frames, even then it was very difficult to use this medium for long-term change. And social media itself as a class segregated entity seems to have become an active player in deciding which issues and movements are given the privilege of political consideration and support. And we'd love to look at this more in the future, focusing on different bystander audiences, focusing on different forms of interaction, focusing on this idea possibly of political community rather than political organizations or movement organizations being the targeting force, because we are seeing communities of politics in some sense building on social media that do perhaps lead to this change. We're not sure. So those are some of the directions we'd like to go. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Divya. So, are there any questions for Divya? Okay, Anthony has a question. Anthony, can someone?
Oh, I see it.
Should I read it?
Yeah, Anthony,
Yeah,
you want
that
to
would
note
be
it.
great.
Sure. Hi, Divya. Thank you very much for your talk. Definitely, this is done in the Indian context, but obviously there's all sorts of social movements ongoing in the United States right now, and so it's very relevant, I think, to my own experiences. Can you talk a little bit more about what characterizes frame transformation? Is it sort of an educational process? Is it a acculturational process? And and why might it be so difficult to accomplish in digital spaces?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, agreed. I'm in California right now. Absolutely fascinating time, inspiring in many ways in US politics. So, right, frame transformation. I mean, the idea is you have to instill specific frames in your audience with very little to go off of, right? And so this can be a question of active education. It also can be other changes over time. I mean, perhaps my frames transform because of other life experiences I have. That is more of an acculturation process. But in terms of targeting frame transformation, if a movement wants to do it actively, it often is a question of education, because you have to be the force that does that in someone's life. So as a movement, it is definitely this idea of education, but as a concept, it can happen in other ways. And I think the difficulty online comes from, how do you reach someone online? How do you reach someone who doesn't have any connection to your movement, who isn't, in the affected population often, but is also not in the population maybe that even interacts with the affected population, maybe does not think about this on a day-to-day basis. And often we see, and we could look into this more, and it would be very interesting in terms of like networks and how do you share something out. But from what we've heard, and this was a subjective qualitative study, of course, but from what we've heard, it's just this idea that there's no way to break through, that there's no people who come to your movement for that education, who are audiences for your movement in any way, that are then able to transform online. And that's why a lot of movements, and they may not put it in these terms, of course, but they end up moving some of their frame transformation work offline. So some of the other movements, anti-corruption movements we worked with, they stopped doing various kinds of online education that they started off doing and have moved fully to, workshops in real life. And they were saying, look, a lot fewer people come to these, or RSVP, we don't get likes, but if 3 or 4 or 10 people come to our workshop, we end up seeing they end up coming back to the movement, or they use the things we teach them. It's a know your legal rights kind of workshop, much more than if we put something out and we get so many likes and then those people just don't seem to ever come back. And so I think those are some of the pieces of what makes the transformation very difficult online.
Can I, if I may ask a follow-up question? Sorry. It seems like a slight mismatch, though, between what you're saying is the challenge here and what is the difficulty with online environments, because you're saying that the deeper engagement is useful, but at the same time, it's difficult to find the right and engage and find the right people and have access to them. But at the same time, like online environments and online social networks are well noted for their ability to bridge connections and have very vast networks. So how does that potentially relate to being able to find those people?
Yeah.
Divya, you have 1 minute to answer this question.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, actually, skip my question. Answer someone else's question, because Nassim.
No. There you go.
I was going to say, though, quickly, I think access to a network is very different from access to a real audience that is willing to be a part of the educational piece. And like, to educate someone in this frame transformative way, you need buy-in from that side, right? So someone may see your post. I haven't done the quantitative research on this, but I agree, right? Like, there is a huge amount of access. Someone may see someone's like, retweet, share, whatever. Someone may see that post, but in terms of engaging to the extent that education happens, that sort of access is very limited. So I think that's what the interplay is.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so we have Nassim Mutalibi from the audience. Can someone unmute?
Hello, everyone. Thanks for the great talk. I'm just going to read my question because that will be faster. So my question is about the longer term implications of the study and the sustainability, which you mentioned, of a movement on social media, especially when new voices emerge as an idea and a movement is created and spread to the public, basically? How do organizations manage, moderate new voices that may be in favor or in opposed to the emerging movement? I was wondering if that's a question that you actually considered asking in your interviews. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we didn't ask it actively. I actually think it's so relevant that it ended up coming out in some of the interviews. And it seems that the movements that are trying to move towards, and none of the movements we worked with are fully here yet, some of the digital feminist organizations are closest, the movements that work towards building a political community online, rather than just sort of disseminating information online, are the ones who I think are most able and most currently good at, in a sense, or most currently successful with incorporating new voices quickly, sort of changing the ways they interact as feedback comes in, and things like that. And a lot of the other movements that are much less digitally focused initially, much less urban in a lot of ways, struggle with new voices in the movement. They're often, I mean, a lot of the activists we spoke to there have been doing the work for decades. And so there isn't that emphasis on new voices. There isn't necessarily that quick feedback emphasis that we see with these organizations that are more at home on social media. So that's sort of where we were getting with that question, but I think it's fascinating, and we'd absolutely love to focus on it more if we did.
Thanks, Divya.